The Judge Tree by Swan. I am about to share a story that up until now has been a family secret. It begins in Northern California, where my sister and I were both born. My mother worked in the state capitol building for the state treasurer's office, there in Sacramento. She became a single mom the year I turned 13. My father was killed by an armed robber while at a gas station getting gas on his way to work. The suspect was never caught. Then within just a couple of weeks of my father being murdered, my grandparents were also killed during what appeared to be a home invasion and burglary at their home, leaving my mother totally alone except for myself and my younger sister, who was 11 at the time. It wasn't long after these two tragedies that we began to realize that there may have been something more sinister behind our loved ones' deaths. Within days of my grandparents' deaths, my mom started getting lots of strange calls at home. Some were just hang-up calls. Others were where you could hear someone breathing on the other end of the phone line. This was a time before cell phones. We only had landlines back then. My mom would ask who was there many times and would never get a reply. So she would just hang up on whoever it was that called. As the weeks went on, the calls came in more frequently, to the point all of us were afraid to even answer the phone anymore. When we stopped answering the phone, within 2 days, shots rang out in our living room, windows shattered. This happened 3 times within a 2-week period. The police would respond, but they never found any clues to work with. We wanted to move, but we weren't able to afford it, so we just boarded up the broken windows and hoped it would end soon. That was wishful thinking. Within just a couple of days of boarding up the windows, my sister and I came home from school and noticed all the locks and doorknobs had been removed from our house. It was quiet inside, so we decided to enter and see if anything was stolen. And then we planned on calling our mom at work to let her know what happened. We walked through the front room. Nothing seemed amiss. But then we reached the kitchen. There on the kitchen table were hundreds of photographs of my mother and of us. They all seemed to have been taken from the outside of our house through the windows. Someone had been watching us for a very long time. Then we noticed on the far left side of the table there were a few pictures of us that had been colored on with red marker. They were gruesome looking, like we had been stabbed or shot. All of us scared, we ran out of the house screaming to our neighbors across the street and banged on her door for help. After she let us in, we told her what happened. She immediately called the police and then our mother at work. The police were at our house shortly before my mom arrived. They were packaging up evidence and dusting for fingerprints on the doors and other areas of the house, hoping to be able to match them to a suspect. They told my mother that we should stay somewhere else, if at all possible, until they were able to make an arrest. We all went to a hotel that night since we had no more family left in the area. We did, however, have the family cabin still, where we used to spend most weekends during the summer and all of our vacations. It had been in our family for 3 generations, and we loved it there, high in the Sierra Nevada mountains, between Placerville and Lake Tahoe, right off Highway 50. It was a very isolated place, and we always felt safe there, so my mom decided we should go there for a while. She took leave from work the next day, and we headed up to the cabin in her car. We were excited to get away from Sacramento and all of the horrible things that had been happening to us. We stopped and got food, supplies, toiletries in Placerville that would last us for several weeks. As we continued our drive to our cabin, we began talking about all of the horrible things, and the more we talked about them, the more we began wondering if all the sudden deaths of our father and grandparents were somehow tied into all of this. The timing was just too coincidental and suspicious. After talking about that possibility, we all became silent with our own thoughts until we reached the cabin. Everything looked fine there, nothing out of place, so we unloaded our things and all the groceries. My mother fixed dinner for all of us, and we finally began to relax a bit. Finally beginning to feel safe, a feeling none of us had had for a very long time. As it got later in the evening, and we were thinking of turning in, my sister and I asked our mom if we could sleep out on the balcony under the stars in the big pine trees, just like we used to do. Since there were no stairs from the outside of the balcony that was just off the living room, she agreed that would be fine. The cabin was 2 stories, but the stairs were on the outside of the actual building. The first floor was a large dorm-style room that was used by guests, and totally separate from the main cabin, where my grandparents had their own bedroom, along with the kitchen, dining, and living room areas. The stairs began near the door to the dorm-style room and went up the side of the mountain to the outside of the second floor door to enter into the main cabin. It is important to note that we had no indoor plumbing there at the cabin. We hauled water to use in the kitchen and to wash up with, and the toilet facility was an actual outhouse, which was about 35 feet further up the side of the mountain. As my sister and I carried our sleeping bags out to the balcony and settled in to talk and tell stories like we always did, we said hi to our friend that we called the Judge. He was a large, towering pine tree that grew very close to the balcony and had been there for as long as we could remember. We had always called him the Judge. I thought because of the way his bark looked. It looked like he had a very stern face, so it seemed to fit him. I can't actually remember naming him the Judge, but that was what we had always called him. We had always felt safe sleeping out there under the stars, knowing he was there watching over us. And that was especially true that night. Everything was fine when we woke up the next morning. Mom had made us breakfast. After we got up and got dressed, we all felt a bit relieved being far away from Sacramento. But we were still pretty tired from all of the stress that we went through the past few weeks. We decided we should go down to the river and relax, laying out in the sun on the big rocks down there. We also took our large inner tubes just in case we got the energy to go tubing down the river. The sun was so warm as we lay on the big rocks and so relaxing that we fell asleep. I'm not sure how long, but when we woke, we were starving, so we raced back to the cabin for lunch. My mom made grilled cheese sandwiches and soup for us, and then excused herself for a trip up the mountain to the outhouse. We began eating, and then after just a few minutes, we heard screaming. My sister and I froze in horror. The screams were coming from the outhouse, and it was our mother screaming for her life. Then we heard her screaming to us, "Run! Run to the highway! Get away before he gets you! Run! Run! Run, girls!" So we did. We ran out of the cabin, and just as we got to the top of the stairs, we saw him running down from the outhouse towards us. We both began running down the stairs as fast as we could, knowing that he was much bigger than us and could probably catch us if we slowed down. We kept running as fast as we could, fearing for our lives. When we got to the bottom of the stairs and began to turn left towards the road, we saw out of the corner of our eyes what looked like a huge limb, or a shadow of a limb, swooping down towards the ground, but we kept running. But then almost immediately we heard the sounds of cracking bones, and groaning, the groaning of a man, and then a very loud thump. As we slowed our running to turn around to see what the noises were, we saw what looked to be the man that was chasing us on the ground, in a crumpled up heap, blood coming out of his nose and ears. He looked lifeless and dead. We stopped and stared and waited to see if he would get up or not. We kept looking at how broken up he was. His legs looked like they had been snapped in half and bent backwards, and his neck laid at a very odd angle. Still completely terrified, we just stood there, stared at him, to see if we could see his chest move, like if he was still breathing. We couldn't see it move. So after a very long time, we decided he must be dead. But how? He was very far away from the bottom of the stairs, like he had somehow been thrown 30 feet or more from them. It just didn't make sense to us how far away he was from the stairs and how severe the injuries were. As we stood there trying to figure it all out, a breeze picked up and the tree's limbs began to move a little, and we looked up at the judge and saw that his stern face had turned into a smiling face. We stood there staring at him, trying to figure out how that could be. How could his stern face turn into a smiling face? We were so confused and trying to process all of these strange things, but all we could think of was that somehow the judge had swept down and stopped this evil stalker from getting us. There was no other explanation. What could it have been? And now, here he was smiling down at us, as if to say, "You're safe now." It was truly a miracle. As we were coming to terms with this, we suddenly heard our mother screaming for someone to help her. We snapped out of our deep thoughts and started running up the stairs and then up the trail to the outhouse where our mother had been locked up. We quickly untied the rope that had been wrapped around the outhouse, trapping her inside. When she stepped out, she began hugging us both. We were all shaking and crying, and then we started telling her what had happened when we began running away like she told us to do. As we were saying out loud what we had both been thinking back there, looking up at the judge, we began thinking how crazy it sounded, and our faces must have shown that confusion. That's when our mother told us that she knew that that was exactly what happened. She began telling us a story of long ago when she was just a teenager, and how the judge had once saved her life too, all those years ago. But that's another story for another time.